this short video, we're just going to talk about me, a beginner, learning how to paint power swords. So I own 4 Grey Knights. I own a Castellan Crow, which you can see in the background, which is a proxy. I own 4 Grey Knight proxies. Let's be fair with myself. I own a Brotherhood Librarian, and I own a... Oh, I can't remember exactly what he's called. He's called like a Brother Chaplain or something. He's not a chaplain. Anyway, and I own a Nemesis Dread Knight, which is an awesome proxy that I will show you very, very soon. But today we're talking about power swords, because I set myself a challenge when I finished painting all the grey on the Grey Knights of let's paint some power swords, and you can see my first attempt on the screen. I wanted to paint this alternating colour effect, so white, dark, light, dark, light, dark, but you can see clearly here the main problem on my first attempt is just like lack of blending on my zone. So that was the thing I really had to tackle and learn, was how to do better blending. So I had some blends that I was happy with, and I figured out that generally what had been happening there was I had a lot less paint on my brush, and I was just thinning it out and doing a proper blend. And the other thing I started doing, which I saw in a tutorial, which is very useful, was using the tip of my brush to make the blend less rigid. So it stopped being... So because when I did this originally, I was basically holding my brush sideways like this and doing a straight line on both sides to make my zone and then filling in the middle, and I realized that led to a very strict zone of color, which wasn't actually what I wanted, and also kept the paint quite thick because I was layering it on over the edge of the sword and making this really strong zone. So I realized that was a bit of a problem, and after doing that on these 3, including this halberd, I realized it wasn't really what I was going for. So I decided just to start again, and I just got rid of these 4 attempts and just tried again, and decided to see where I ended up. I decided to try 4 zones on the sword, the big sword, just because it was bigger. That was a mess. I didn't really like the 4 zones at all, but I did like a few more of the transitions that I'd done. I liked a bit more. I did a bit of wet blending on some of them, which is where you take 2 colors that are still wet on your sword and kind of mix the edges together. That was a lot of fun, and I kind of did a bit of the same here, and I was really happy, especially on this sword, with some of the layers, but I didn't like how washed it looked or how mixed it looked. The halberd I started to be happier with once I started cleaning things up a bit. This is the worst photo of it that I took, but if you actually looked at it at this time, it was like very clearly delineated from the front and it looked really good, though this photo itself was a bit rough. So for my third attempt then, I just decided, let's get rid of the 4 zones, let's just do 2. So I did light to dark on the big sword, and I was much happier because I had given myself a lot more space with the blends. And I'd given myself a lot more sort of freedom to do sort of rough edges. You can see up here, like the edge is actually quite rough, and down here as well. So by giving myself more space, I could spread the paint out more, do a much softer gradient. I also started going back over the previous gradients when it made sense with a wash of the previous color, and that kind of also smoothed the edges out a little bit more as well, which made it a lot easier to paint too. So I was kind of happy with that as well. This sword got a little bit better. This halberd didn't improve much with that one, but I was really impressed with how this improved, and it kind of gave me a bit of hope that I could probably get the technique to where I wanted it to be. You can kind of see some of the Skaven I'm working on just randomly sticking up in the background of all of these photos. So after that, I thought, well, we're going to have to try again, but there's way too much paint on this miniature. So I decided to take the brave step, definitely brave for a beginner, of stripping the paint off the sword. Thankfully, the arm is not actually glued in. I wanted to be able to change the weapon, so I have actually not glued in the arm. It's just attached with a bit of blue tack, so I just took that off, put the weapon in a cup of paint thinner, and then just took the paint off and tried again. I also attached some other weapons to a bit of plastic so I could practice on them, the new technique, before diving straight into the finished result. And the only other thing I did, which is important to acknowledge, is I bought a retarder medium from Vallejo, which slows down the drying of the layer so that you can spread it out more, basically. So you can spread it out more and work it slower, and it also dries out slower on my wet palette, so I could then paint normally. In terms of tools, by the way, I use for this, so I have my glazed retarder medium, I have a wet palette, I have some Rosemary & Co. sable brushes, as well as some acrylic brushes that I use for bigger tasks, and generally just working with those to get a good finish. So how did it turn out? This is the final attempt, and this is where I'm leaving it for now, but you can kind of see how things turned out. So on the left we have a halberd, which I quite like, though it does probably need a bit more blending between the darkest blues and the blacks and things to get it clean. But then you have this power sword, which I really like. And the only thing I don't like about this power sword is that I don't have a mini that it is attached to, or to attach it to. So I need another Grey Knight to put this on, but I'm really happy with how that ended up. I bought another blue as well, which is this Imperial blue you see here, and this darker blue as well. So I have another 2 dark blues basically to work with, and this time I started with the base coat of this Imperial blue, which was quite nice. So I really liked how that sword ended out. And then the big sword for the grand reveal is this, and I think this worked out really, really nicely. Unfortunately, I did break the sword off while I was paint stripping it, so I did have to super glue here, and you can kind of see the messiness at the bottom, which is the super glue, not the paint, because I didn't really super glue it back together perfectly. But you can see, you can see it doing everything I want it to do perfectly. So I've got my white lines, and then my slow fade down into a darker, slow fade into a darker, darker, until we get to the very dark patches opposite the white, and then coming back up again. This white, little chalky here, which I didn't really like, a little chalky here as well, but in general I think this looks much better than it did before. I think I probably could do it one more time, but I'm not going to. I think I'm happy enough with this now. The only thing I'm really not happy with is the quality of the edge highlighting. There's really just too much paint coming off the brush at certain points, which is kind of frustrating, but you know, I'm still a beginner, so this is fine, but I think it turned out pretty well. What do you reckon? I mean, how did I do? Are there any tips for how I should improve for my next Grey Knights? I am going to look to get some more Grey Knights, but I'm also kind of conscious that they may be getting some new models next year, so I don't really want to rush out and buy a lot of stuff and then find out that, like everyone else, they've got a Primaris upgrade. But, you know, I'm always happy to hear suggestions on how I could improve, and I'm really happy, I think, with the level of improvement I did, because this was roughly 3 or 4 days worth of painting. You know, I had a pretty free and easy week in the evenings, so I did this one day, and then the next day I did this, and then the day after that I did, well, no, it was this one day, and then we went into the 5 zones the next day, and then the day after that I did this, and then I think 2 days later I did this, because I had to wait for some new paints to arrive, and I think that was just some really good progression, so I was really happy with that. Anyway, let me know your thoughts. Thanks for joining me on this Warhammer journey. For my Fab listeners, I do still talk about Fab. I'm just having a bit of a thing with this. I'm still playing Fab and still very much enjoying Fab, but you know, you've got to have some variety in your interests as you progress through your gaming life, you know.